Anna Whitmore stood in the warm afternoon light beside the church gate, while Sheriff Douglas Pike guided his horse to a quiet stop a few steps away, the animal lowering its head slightly, as if it too respected the calm of a wedding day. The sheriff removed his hat with slow courtesy and offered a small nod that carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I hope I have not arrived too late for the celebration." Anna returned the greeting with the same steady calm she had carried all afternoon, the lace of her veil moving gently in the breeze that passed through the cottonwood trees above the churchyard. "You are right on time, Sheriff Pike," she replied. "The ceremony has not started yet." Around them the wedding guests watched with polite smiles, though a few curious eyes moved between the sheriff and the decorated wagon standing nearby. Sheriff Pike rested one hand on the saddle horn and allowed his gaze to drift slowly across the yard. Dry Creek had always been a quiet town, but the sheriff had learned long ago that quiet places often held the most interesting stories. He noticed the ribbons tied to the wagon rails, the nervous driver sitting stiff on the front bench, and the church doors standing open where the pastor waited patiently inside. Then his eyes returned to Anna. "I have been riding since early morning," he said calmly, following a trail that passed close to this road. The breeze carried a faint creak from the wagon wheels as the driver shifted in his seat, pretending to adjust the reins while carefully avoiding the sheriff's gaze. Anna folded her hands lightly in front of her dress. "A trail can lead to many places in this valley," she said. Sheriff Pike gave a small thoughtful nod. "That is true. Sometimes it leads to a ranch, sometimes to the railroad, and sometimes," he added slowly, "it leads straight through a wedding procession." The words settled softly into the air between them. A few guests glanced toward the wagon again before quickly returning their attention to the flowers in their hands. Inside the carriage, Caleb Mercer sat motionless, listening through the wooden panels as the calm voice of the sheriff drifted through the warm afternoon air. He had heard that voice once before in a distant town, when the lawman had asked quiet questions about a man traveling under the wrong kind of reputation. Caleb kept his breathing steady and remained in the shadowed corner of the seat, where sunlight could not easily reach him. Outside, Anna tilted her head slightly, as if considering the sheriff's words. "It is a fortunate day for trails then," she said gently. "They all seem to lead to the church." Sheriff Pike studied her expression for a moment longer, the corner of his mouth lifting in the faintest trace of a smile. "Well, Miss Whitmore," he said, "weddings have a way of bringing people together in unexpected ways." He glanced once more toward the decorated wagon, where the driver now stared firmly at the ground. Then the sheriff swung one leg over the saddle and stepped down beside his horse, dust settling around his boots as he began walking slowly toward the churchyard gate and the waiting carriage. The churchyard grew quiet in the slow way small towns often do when something unexpected begins to unfold. Sheriff Douglas Pike walked across the dusty ground with calm, unhurried steps, his boots pressing shallow prints into the earth while the cottonwood leaves above whispered in the afternoon breeze. The decorated wagon stood only a few yards away now, its bright ribbons moving softly in the wind like they had nothing to worry about. Yet the man sitting on the front bench held the reins tighter than necessary. The driver watched the sheriff approach and forced himself to breathe normally, though his eyes flicked once toward the carriage door and then back to the ground. Around them, the wedding guests pretended to busy themselves with small conversations, but nearly every glance returned to the same place. Sheriff Pike stopped beside the wagon wheel and rested his hand lightly against the polished wood as if simply admiring the craftsmanship. "Beautiful carriage," he said casually. The driver nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Built in Denver 3 years ago. Good wheels." Sheriff Pike smiled faintly, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "Wheels are important on these roads," he said. "A wagon needs to travel far without trouble." He glanced slowly toward the carriage door where the curtains inside hung perfectly still. Inside that quiet space, Caleb Mercer sat without moving, his back straight against the wooden panel while the bundle of bread rested untouched in his hands. Through the thin wall he could hear every word spoken outside and the soft creak of leather when the sheriff shifted his weight beside the wheel. Caleb knew men like Douglas Pike did not rely only on luck. They relied on patience. Outside, Anna Whitmore remained near the church gate, speaking politely with 2 elderly guests who had traveled from a neighboring ranch. She kept her voice calm and pleasant, yet her eyes moved occasionally toward the wagon where the sheriff now stood. Sheriff Pike lifted his hand and tapped lightly against the wagon frame, not loud enough to alarm anyone, but enough to test the silence inside. Then he turned toward the driver again. "Tell me something," he said. "Did you pass anyone interesting on the road today?" The driver swallowed once before answering. "Just a few ranch hands heading west, Sheriff. Nothing unusual." The sheriff nodded slowly, as if considering the answer. "The trail I followed came within a mile of this road," he said quietly. "A single rider traveling fast. Horse was tired. Rider more so." The breeze shifted again across the churchyard, carrying the distant smell of dry grass from the valley. Inside the carriage, Caleb Mercer lowered his eyes toward the wooden floor and waited. Outside, Sheriff Pike looked once more at the closed carriage door and then toward Anna Whitmore standing beneath the cottonwood trees in her white dress. "Weddings are curious gatherings," he said thoughtfully. "People arrive from every direction and sometimes bring unexpected company along the way." He placed his hand gently on the carriage handle, as if preparing to open the door and see exactly what kind of company had arrived in Dry Creek that afternoon. For a brief moment, the entire churchyard seemed to hold its breath as Sheriff Douglas Pike's hand rested on the carriage handle. The polished metal caught the afternoon sunlight, throwing a thin line of brightness across the dusty ground while the cottonwood leaves whispered overhead. The driver sat stiff on the front bench, staring straight ahead, as if the reins in his hands required all his attention. A few wedding guests had fallen silent, their conversations fading into uneasy quiet while they watched the sheriff beside the decorated wagon. 20 feet away, Anna Whitmore stood beneath the shade of the trees, her white dress moving gently in the breeze while her calm eyes followed the lawman's slow movement. Sheriff Pike did not hurry. Men who had spent years tracking difficult trails rarely rushed the final moment. Instead, he rested his fingers against the handle and listened to the soft creak of the wagon frame, the shifting leather of the horse's harness, and the distant murmur of the valley wind. Inside the carriage, Caleb Mercer sat perfectly still, the bundle of bread resting in his hands while a narrow beam of sunlight slipped through the curtain and touched the floor beside his boots. He could hear the sheriff's voice clearly through the wooden wall, calm and patient, the voice of a man who believed answers eventually revealed themselves. Caleb had traveled long miles to stay ahead of that voice. Now it stood one thin door away. Outside, the sheriff turned his head slightly toward the church gate, where Anna remained standing. "Miss Whitmore," he called in a courteous tone, "I hope you will forgive the interruption on such an important day." Anna stepped forward across the dusty yard, the soft rustle of her dress the only sound between them. Sheriff Pike removed his hat again with polite respect. "Weddings are important gatherings in towns like ours," he said. "They bring together neighbors, travelers, and sometimes a few surprises along the road." Anna stopped a few steps from the wagon and met his steady gaze without hesitation. "Surprises are part of life in the valley, Sheriff," she replied gently. Sheriff Pike nodded as if agreeing with a familiar truth. "That is very well said," he answered. He then glanced back at the carriage door where his hand still rested. "I was following a trail earlier today," he continued calmly. "It led near the southern ridge and passed within a mile of this very road." The dust told an interesting story. Anna listened without changing her expression. "Dry Creek sees many riders," she said. The sheriff's eyes softened with a trace of quiet amusement. "True enough," he replied. "But this particular rider had a horse nearly out of strength and the sort of urgency that comes from knowing someone might be close behind." The breeze moved across the yard again, carrying the scent of dry grass from beyond the town. Several guests shifted uneasily near the church steps. Sheriff Pike turned his attention fully back to Anna Whitmore. "I wondered if perhaps your wagon passed a traveler in need along the road today." Anna looked briefly toward the church where the open doors waited and the pastor still stood patiently inside. Then she returned her gaze to the sheriff and spoke with calm certainty. "Our wagon carried only wedding guests, Sheriff. No travelers. No strangers. Just people on their way to a ceremony." Sheriff Pike studied her face for a long silent moment, then slowly lifted his hand away from the carriage handle as the quiet tension drifted through the warm afternoon air. The quiet that followed Anna Whitmore's words drifted through the churchyard like a slow-moving shadow. Sheriff Douglas Pike studied her face for another long second, his expression calm and unreadable, the kind worn by a man who had spent many years deciding when to press a question and when to let the silence speak instead. The warm breeze stirred the cottonwood branches above them, sending small patches of sunlight shifting across the ground between the church gate and the waiting wagon. Around them, the wedding guests began to breathe again, though their conversations remained careful and low. Sheriff Pike finally placed his hat back on his head and gave a small, thoughtful nod, as if accepting the answer offered to him. "Well, Miss Whitmore," he said in an easy tone, "a wedding day deserves to stay peaceful." Anna returned the nod with quiet composure, though her hands rested tightly together at the front of her dress. The sheriff stepped away from the carriage and walked a few slow paces across the churchyard, his boots pressing soft tracks in the dust while the driver on the wagon seat released a breath he had been holding far too long. Inside the carriage, Caleb Mercer remained perfectly still, listening to every movement outside the thin wooden wall. The sheriff's footsteps grew faint as he moved toward the hitching rail where his horse waited patiently beneath the shade. Caleb allowed his eyes to close for just a moment, feeling the tight knot in his chest ease slightly. But the calm did not last long. Sheriff Pike paused beside his horse and turned again toward the churchyard gathering. The people of Dry Creek had begun returning their attention to the ceremony waiting inside the white wooden church. The pastor stood at the doorway with patient dignity, watching the afternoon slowly stretch forward. Sheriff Pike rested one hand on his saddle and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the yard without sounding harsh. "Before I leave," he said, "there is something the town should hear." The quiet conversations faded again as people looked toward him. Even Anna Whitmore turned slightly, her veil shifting in the breeze while the sunlight touched the edge of the lace. Sheriff Pike continued with the calm, steady tone of a man delivering news rather than accusation. Early this morning, a message arrived from the railroad office in Santa Fe. It concerned a man traveling under the name Caleb Mercer. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances at the unfamiliar name. Inside the carriage, Caleb's eyes opened slowly as the words drifted through the wooden panels. Sheriff Pike rested both hands on the saddle horn while he spoke. The message did not describe a criminal charge. In fact, it said the opposite. The railroad company had been searching for this man for several weeks, hoping to locate him before a misunderstanding turned into something worse. The breeze moved softly across the churchyard again, lifting the dust in small circles around the sheriff's boots. The message explained that Caleb Mercer once worked as a survey rider for a new rail line crossing the valley. During a land dispute last year, he refused to sign a false report that would have forced several small ranch families from their property. The company dismissed him quietly, and a few powerful men decided to make the situation appear very different. Sheriff Pike looked slowly across the faces gathered in the churchyard. "According to the message," he said, "the company has now corrected that mistake. They want Caleb Mercer found so they can clear his name and offer him his position back." The sheriff paused a moment and glanced toward the decorated wagon standing quietly beside the church gate. The churchyard fell into a deeper silence after Sheriff Douglas Pike finished speaking, the kind of silence that arrives when a story suddenly turns in a direction no one expected. A few guests exchanged puzzled looks while the cottonwood leaves above them whispered softly in the breeze, as if the trees themselves were passing along the news from one branch to another. Anna Whitmore stood near the gate, her hands still folded calmly against the front of her dress, yet the weight of the sheriff's words settled gently in her mind. Inside the decorated wagon, Caleb Mercer sat motionless, listening to the explanation drift through the wooden walls like distant thunder rolling across the plains. For many miles he had carried the belief that the world behind him was closing its doors one by one. Now, outside the wagon, the sheriff's calm voice had quietly opened one of them again. Sheriff Pike rested his arm across the saddle horn while the people of Dry Creek slowly absorbed the message. A misunderstanding corrected by the railroad company was not the kind of news that traveled quickly across frontier towns. Rumors often rode faster than truth across the West, and by the time truth arrived it usually found men already tired from running. One of the older ranchers near the church steps finally spoke in a cautious tone. "Sheriff," he asked, "does that mean the man you were tracking is no longer wanted?" Sheriff Pike nodded slowly. "According to the telegram, the company wants him found so the matter can be settled properly. The law in this town has no reason to hold him. The breeze carried the faint creak of the wagon again, while the driver shifted slightly on the front seat, uncertain whether he should look relieved or simply pretend none of this had anything to do with him. A young boy near the hitching rail asked his father quietly who this Caleb Mercer was, and the man answered with a shrug that said the world often changed its mind about people. Sheriff Pike looked once more across the yard, and then toward the decorated wagon where the curtains remained drawn. There was no accusation in his voice when he spoke again, only the steady patience of someone who had followed many trails before. "If that rider happens to pass through Dry Creek today," he said calmly, "I would advise him to step forward and hear the news for himself. It would save him many more miles of unnecessary running." Anna Whitmore lifted her gaze toward the wagon at those words. The soft white fabric of her veil stirred again in the afternoon wind. For a moment she did not move, as if allowing the silence to finish its work. Then she turned slowly and walked across the dusty yard toward the carriage. The guests watched quietly, unsure what the bride intended, while the sheriff remained beside his horse with the faintest hint of curiosity resting in his eyes. Anna reached the wagon door and placed her hand gently on the handle, the same handle the sheriff had nearly opened only minutes earlier. The metal felt warm from the sun. She paused for a brief moment, listening to the quiet breathing inside the carriage. Then she spoke in a calm voice meant for only one person to hear. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly, "it appears the road behind you may not be chasing you anymore." For several quiet seconds after Anna Whitmore spoke, nothing moved inside the decorated wagon except the slow shifting of sunlight across the wooden floorboards. Caleb Mercer sat where he had been all afternoon, the small bundle of bread resting loosely in his hands, while the sound of the churchyard drifted softly through the thin carriage walls. Outside he could hear the distant murmur of guests, the creak of saddle leather as Sheriff Douglas Pike rested beside his horse, and the gentle whisper of wind passing through the cottonwood trees. But it was Anna's voice that held his attention now, calm and certain, the voice of someone who had already made her choice long before the rest of the town understood what was happening. Caleb lowered his head for a moment and breathed slowly, as if measuring the weight of the road he had traveled and the road that might finally be ending. For weeks he had ridden from ridge to ridge, always believing the next town would bring another warning, another closed door, another mile of dust to cross before sunset. Now the sheriff himself had stood in the churchyard and spoken words Caleb Mercer had not expected to hear again. The law in this town has no reason to hold him. The thought settled quietly in his mind like rain after a long drought. Outside the wagon, Anna waited patiently beside the door, her hand still resting on the warm metal handle. She did not knock again or repeat his name. She simply stood there in the afternoon light, the white fabric of her dress moving gently in the valley breeze while the wedding guests watched from a respectful distance. Some of them had begun to understand that the bride was not only waiting for a ceremony to begin. She was waiting for a man inside a wooden carriage to decide whether the world had truly changed. Sheriff Pike observed the scene from beside the hitching rail, his eyes thoughtful but not unkind. He had spent enough years riding the frontier to know that men who carried heavy reputations often needed time to set them down. Inside the wagon, Caleb Mercer finally placed the untouched bread carefully on the seat beside him. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat with slow, steady hands, the same way a man might prepare himself before stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Then he stood, the movement quiet but certain in the small space of the carriage. The wagon shifted slightly under his weight, just enough for the driver to glance nervously over his shoulder. Outside, Anna Whitmore heard the faint movement through the wooden door and lifted her chin a little higher, as if greeting the moment before it fully arrived. Caleb rested his hand on the carriage latch from the inside. For a brief moment he paused there, listening to the quiet churchyard beyond the door, the murmured voices, the distant creak of a sign swinging above the general store, and the slow, patient breathing of Sheriff Pike's horse across the dust. Then the latch turned with a soft metallic click, and the carriage door began to open into the warm afternoon light of Dry Creek. The carriage door opened slowly, and the afternoon light of Dry Creek spilled into the narrow space, like a quiet invitation. Caleb Mercer stepped down onto the dusty ground with the steady caution of a man who had spent many weeks expecting the world to close around him. The churchyard watched in complete silence. Wedding guests who had arrived expecting music and vows now found themselves witnessing something far rarer on the frontier, a moment when a man carried a long shadow into the open and waited to see if it still followed him. Caleb straightened beside the wagon and adjusted the brim of his hat against the sunlight, his eyes briefly scanning the gathered faces before settling on Sheriff Douglas Pike across the yard. The sheriff remained beside his horse, calm and still, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. The breeze moved softly through the cottonwood branches, carrying the distant creak of a wooden sign from the general store and the low rustle of dresses among the wedding guests. For a moment neither man spoke. The quiet held the entire yard in place, like a photograph caught in the late afternoon light. Then Caleb walked forward across the dust, each step deliberate, stopping several yards from the sheriff. "I heard what you said," Caleb spoke at last, his voice steady though the long road behind it could still be heard. Sheriff Pike nodded slowly. "The telegram arrived this morning," he replied. "Sometimes the truth rides slower than the rumors." Caleb gave a faint, tired smile at that. "That has been my experience." Around them the people of Dry Creek listened carefully, their earlier curiosity now turning into quiet understanding. The sheriff rested one hand on the saddle horn and studied Caleb for a moment longer. "You traveled far to outrun a mistake that was never yours," he said calmly. "The railroad wants to correct it. They are waiting for you to return." Caleb looked toward the open valley beyond the churchyard, the same valley he had crossed earlier that day, believing he might never pass through it again. The wind brushed across the dry grass and carried the scent of distant hills. For the first time in many miles his shoulders seemed to relax slightly, as if the road had finally allowed him to step off its endless path. He turned his gaze back toward Anna Whitmore, standing quietly beside the wagon. The white lace of her veil moved gently in the sunlight, while her calm expression held the same quiet kindness that had stopped the wagon hours earlier on the empty road. Caleb removed his hat respectfully and gave a small nod toward her. "I suppose I owe you more than a thank you," he said softly. Anna answered with the same gentle calm that had guided her decisions all afternoon. "You owed me nothing, Mr. Mercer. A traveler needed help. That was all." Sheriff Pike allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear as he watched the exchange. "Well then," he said, "perhaps the town of Dry Creek can return to the wedding it has been patiently waiting for." The guests began to stir again as the tension finally loosened its grip on the yard. The pastor stepped forward from the church doorway and cleared his throat with polite patience. "The ceremony," he announced kindly, "is still ready whenever the bride is." The quiet energy of the churchyard slowly softened as the weight of the long afternoon finally lifted from the air. Guests who had been standing still for many tense minutes began to breathe normally again, their conversations returning in gentle murmurs beneath the shade of the cottonwood trees. The pastor remained at the open church doors with patient dignity, his hands resting lightly against the worn wooden railing while he waited for the bride to step forward. Sheriff Douglas Pike stood beside his horse with calm satisfaction, the kind that comes when a difficult trail ends without leaving a scar behind. In the warm sunlight, Caleb Mercer remained where he was for a moment longer, the dust of many miles still resting on his boots, yet the long chase that had followed him across the valley now gone as quietly as it had arrived. The wide sky above Dry Creek seemed suddenly larger, the wind softer, the road less heavy beneath his feet. He placed his hat back on his head and looked once more toward Anna Whitmore, who stood beside the decorated wagon where this strange turn of fate had begun earlier that day. The white fabric of her dress moved gently in the breeze, and there was no pride in her eyes, no sense of having done something extraordinary, only the calm kindness of a person who had chosen compassion when the easier choice had been to look away. Caleb stepped toward her slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I spent weeks believing the world had closed its doors behind me," he said quietly. "Today you opened one without even asking my name." Anna offered a small, thoughtful smile. Sometimes a man does not need to explain his whole story to deserve a glass of water and a seat in the shade. Around them, the wedding guests began gathering near the church entrance again, laughter returning little by little as the strange afternoon settled into something people would remember for years. Sheriff Pike lifted himself back into the saddle and adjusted the reins with easy familiarity. "I suspect the railroad office will be glad to hear that their missing survey rider has been found," He called across the yard with a relaxed tone. Caleb nodded in appreciation. I believe I owe them a long ride back and a few honest conversations. The sheriff tipped his hat once more before turning his horse toward the main street of Dry Creek, leaving the churchyard to its celebration. Caleb watched him ride away for a moment, then turned back toward the valley road beyond the town where the evening sun had begun to lower behind the distant hills. For the first time in many days, he did not feel the need to hurry toward it. Instead, he stepped aside from the path leading to the church doors and gestured gently toward the waiting pastor. Your town has been patient long enough, he said to Anna with quiet respect. Anna Whitmore gave a small, grateful nod and walked toward the church where the guests welcomed her with warm smiles and relieved laughter. The doors closed slowly behind the wedding party, while Caleb Mercer remained in the fading sunlight of the yard. A light wind moved through the cottonwood leaves again as he looked down the quiet road that had once carried him toward fear and now seemed to lead toward something steadier. Out on the frontier, justice did not always arrive with loud voices or raised hands. Sometimes it arrived in the quiet courage of a bride who chose kindness on a dusty road 2 miles outside a small town called Dry Creek.